On the night of July 17, 1918, in a basement in Yekaterinburg, Bolshevik soldiers execute Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children. The bullets tear through the family that ruled Russia for 304 years. Anastasia, the youngest daughter, tries to run. The diamonds sewn into her corset deflect the first volley. The soldiers finish her with bayonets. She is 17 years old. But here is what most people never learn. The Romanovs in that basement were not the only Romanovs. When the guns fell silent in Yekaterinburg, more than 60 members of the imperial family were still alive, scattered across Russia, fleeing through revolution and civil war, hiding in Crimean palaces while armies fought for control of the peninsula. Some would escape, some would be murdered in mine shafts and fortress walls, and those who survived would spend the next century fighting over a throne that no longer existed. Grand Duchess Xenia, the Tsar's sister, would escape on a British warship and spend her final decades in a grace and favor cottage provided by her cousin, King George V. She would die in London in 1960, having outlived the empire by 42 years. Grand Duke Kirill, the Tsar's first cousin, would proclaim himself Emperor of all Russia from a rented villa in France in 1924, crowning himself ruler of a country that had abolished the monarchy and murdered its royal family. The Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, mother of the murdered Tsar, would refuse until her dying breath to believe her son was dead. She kept candles burning in her chapel for Nicholas and his children for 8 years after Yekaterinburg, and the claimants who followed, the men and women who insisted they were the legitimate heirs to the Russian throne, would wage legal battles, issue imperial decrees from Paris apartments, and divide the surviving Romanovs into factions that remain hostile to this day. This is what happened to the Romanov bloodline that survived the revolution, and why the descendants of Russia's emperors are still fighting over a crown their family lost more than a century ago. Subscribe if you want more stories of royal bloodlines and the fates they inherited. The Romanovs had ruled Russia since 1613, when a National Assembly elected 16-year-old Michael Romanov as Tsar to end the time of troubles. For 3 centuries, the dynasty expanded the empire from the borders of Poland to the Pacific Ocean. By 1914, the Tsar ruled over 125 million subjects across 22 million square kilometers, 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. The Romanovs were the richest royal family in Europe. Their crown jewels alone were valued at over $160 million. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg contained 1,500 rooms and required 1,000 servants to maintain. But the dynasty that survived the Napoleonic invasion, the assassination of Alexander II, and 3 revolutions in 12 years could not survive Nicholas II. Nicholas was never meant to rule so young. His father, Alexander III, was a giant of a man who survived a train derailment that killed 21 people by holding up the collapsed roof of the dining car while his family escaped. Alexander assumed he had decades left. He was wrong. Kidney disease killed him at 49 in 1894. Nicholas, with 26 years old and utterly unprepared, inherited the largest empire on earth. He was a devoted husband, a loving father, and a disastrous ruler. He believed in autocracy with religious conviction at a moment when the rest of Europe was granting constitutions and parliaments. He appointed incompetent ministers, dismissed competent ones, and allowed his wife Alexandra to fall under the influence of Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian peasant mystic who claimed he could heal the hemophilia that afflicted their only son. The First World War broke the dynasty. Russia mobilized 12 million men. Nearly 2 million died. Bread riots in Petrograd in February 1917 escalated into revolution within days. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas abdicated for himself and his son, hoping his brother Michael would take the throne instead. Michael refused. Our 304 years of Romanov rule ended with the signature in a railway car. The provisional government placed the imperial family under house arrest at the Alexander Palace. Then the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, and the family's situation grew steadily worse. They were moved to Tobolsk in Siberia, then to Yekaterinburg in the Urals. And on that July night in 1918, the local Soviet decided the approaching White Army might liberate the Tsar. They chose murder instead. But the family in that basement represented only a fraction of the Romanov bloodline. The extended dynasty was enormous, Nicholas had 2 surviving sisters, a brother who died young, and dozens of cousins, aunts, and uncles spread across the empire. Some were in Petrograd when the revolution began, others were serving at the front, still others were already in Crimea, the traditional retreat of the imperial family, where the warm climate and palatial estates offered a semblance of peace even as Russia tore itself apart. The Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna was 70 years old when the revolution began. Born Princess Dagmar of Denmark, she had married the future Alexander III in 1866 and became the matriarch of the Romanov clan. She was at her estate in Kiev when Nicholas abdicated. Within days, revolutionary soldiers surrounded her residence. For more than a year, she lived under house arrest, watching the empire her husband had ruled dissolve into chaos. In April 1918, she was permitted to travel to Crimea, where she joined her daughter Xenia and Xenia's husband Grand Duke Alexander at the Dolber Palace. The Crimean Peninsula became a strange refuge. Multiple members of the extended Romanov family gathered there, technically prisoners of the local Soviets but largely left alone as civil war raged across the mainland. They did not know that in July 1918 their relatives in Yekaterinburg had been murdered. They did not know that on July 18th, the day after the Tsar's execution, another group of Romanovs had been thrown down a mine shaft near Alapayevsk and left to die. Among the dead at Alapayevsk were Grand Duchess Elizabeth, the Tsarina's sister, and several of the younger Grand Dukes. The Crimean Romanovs learned the truth slowly in fragments of rumor and unofficial reports. The Dowager Empress refused to believe it. She insisted Nicholas and his family had escaped, that they were hiding somewhere, that they would be found. She maintained this position until her death in 1928, where every year on the anniversary of the massacre, she held memorial services, but she would not call them funerals. Funerals would mean admitting they were gone. In April 1919, the situation in Crimea became critical. The Bolsheviks were advancing. The local Soviet had already executed several Romanovs in Petrograd. The survivors in Crimea faced the same fate unless they escaped. King George V of Britain, first cousin to both Nicholas and Alexandra, had refused to grant the Tsar asylum in 1917, fearing the political backlash of harboring an autocrat. He did not make the same mistake twice. The battleship HMS Marlborough arrived at Yalta on April 7, 1919. The Dowager Empress initially refused to leave. She was eventually convinced by her daughter Xenia and by a personal letter from her sister, Queen Alexandra of Britain. 19 Romanovs boarded the Marlborough. The ship also carried members of other Russian noble families and personal servants. The Dowager Empress brought her Cossack bodyguards, her ladies-in-waiting, and her dogs. She left behind the empire her family had built over 3 centuries. She would never return. The British government settled the Dowager Empress in Denmark, her homeland. She lived at Vidore, a villa near Copenhagen that she had purchased years earlier with her sister Alexandra. She maintained a small court in exile, receiving visitors, corresponding with the scattered Romanov diaspora, and steadfastly refusing to acknowledge that her son was dead. She died on October 13, 1928, at the age of 80. Her final word was reportedly Nicholas. Grand Duchess Xenia, the Tsar's eldest sister, followed a different path. After the evacuation from Crimea, she settled in Britain. King George V provided her with Frogmore Cottage on the Windsor estate, a grace and favor residence that came with no rent but also no income. Xenia had married Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, and together they had 7 children. But the marriage collapsed in exile, destroyed by Alexander's infidelities and the pressures of displacement. Xenia lived at Frogmore Cottage for over 20 years, supported by an allowance from King George V and later Queen Elizabeth II. She sold what jewels she had smuggled out of Russia. She watched her children scatter across Europe and America. She received a stream of visitors claiming to be her niece Anastasia, the youngest daughter of Nicholas, who was rumored to have survived the massacre. Xenia met the most famous of these claimants, Anna Anderson, multiple times. She never publicly confirmed or denied the woman's identity, a diplomatic silence that infuriated other Romanovs who insisted Anderson was a fraud. Xenia died on April 20, 1960, at Wilderness House in Hampton Court Palace. She was 85 years old. Her funeral was attended by members of the British royal family. She was buried at Roquebrune, Cap Martin in France, far from the Russian soil she never saw again. But while Xenia lived quietly in British cottages, another branch of the family was making far bolder claims. Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich was a controversial figure even before the revolution. He had married his first cousin, Victoria Melita, against Nicholas II's explicit prohibition, and had been briefly exiled from Russia as punishment. During the February Revolution of 1917, he had marched his naval guards to the Duma and declared his support for the new government, an act other Romanovs considered a betrayal. But Kirill had one advantage the others lacked. He was the senior surviving male Romanov in the direct line of succession after the deaths at Yekaterinburg, and he intended to use that position. In 1922, Kirill declared himself guardian of the throne, positioning himself as the legitimate authority of the Romanov house. In 1924, living in a rented villa in Coburg, Germany, he went further. He proclaimed himself emperor and autocrat of all the Russias. Kirill I, rightful czar of a country that had abolished the monarchy, executed its royal family, and was now ruled by Joseph Stalin. The proclamation was absurd, and Kirill knew it. He had no army, no territory, no prospect of restoration. But he was establishing a principle that his descendants would maintain for the next century. The Romanov claim to the throne had not died in that basement in Yekaterinburg. It had passed, through the laws of succession, to a new line. Many Romanovs rejected Kirill's claim. The Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna refused to recognize him, in part because she still would not accept that Nicholas was dead. Grand Duchess Xenia and her brother Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, if he had survived, would have had stronger claims. The dispute fractured the already scattered Romanov diaspora into factions. Kirill died in 1938 in Neuilly-sur-Seine, France. His son Vladimir succeeded him as head of the imperial house, continuing the claim through the Soviet era, the Cold War, and the collapse of the USSR. Vladimir never saw Russia. He died in Miami in 1992, just 1 year after the Soviet Union dissolved. His daughter Maria Vladimirovna now styles herself as Grand Duchess and claims headship of the imperial house. In 1991, the bodies found in Yekaterinburg were finally exhumed. DNA testing confirmed they were the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their 5 children. In 2007, a second grave was discovered, containing the remains of Alexei and one of his sisters. The long mystery of the Romanov fate was scientifically resolved, but the family disputes were just beginning. Maria Vladimirovna asserts that she is the legitimate head of the Romanov house and that her son George Mikhailovich is the heir to the Russian imperial legacy. She issues statements on Russian politics, attends Orthodox ceremonies, and maintains the protocols of a royal house in exile. And other Romanovs reject her claims entirely. The Romanov Family Association, representing most surviving descendants, does not recognize Maria's authority. They argue that the laws of succession she cites were violated by her grandmother's morganatic marriage. The dispute has generated lawsuits, public accusations, and a division within the family that shows no sign of healing. George Mikhailovich, born in 1981, represents the next generation of this contested claim. He was raised in France and Spain, educated at Oxford, and has worked in various European institutions. In 2021, he married Rebecca Betterini, an Italian diplomat's daughter who converted to Orthodoxy and took the name Victoria Romanovna. Their wedding in St. Petersburg was the first Romanov wedding on Russian soil in over a century. Now, it was attended by representatives of European royal houses, but boycotted by many Romanovs who disputed Georgia's standing. Today, approximately 120 verified descendants of the Romanov dynasty are scattered across the United States, France, Britain, Spain, Denmark, and a dozen other countries. Some have returned to Russia for visits, attending reburial ceremonies and cultural events. None have recovered the properties, the wealth, or the power their ancestors once held. The Winter Palace is now the Hermitage Museum, visited by 3 million tourists each year. The crown jewels are displayed in the Kremlin Armory. The Fabergé eggs that Nicholas gave Alexandra each Easter are in museums and private collections around the world, selling at auction for tens of millions of dollars. The Romanov name survives in the DNA of European royalty, and through the marriages of Nicholas's aunts and cousins, Romanov blood flows in the veins of the British, Danish, Spanish, Norwegian, and Greek royal families. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was a Romanov descendant. His great-aunt was Alexandra, the murdered Tsarina. The Romanovs lost their empire, but not their bloodline. They lost their palaces, but kept their disputes. A century after the revolution, the descendants of the Tsars are still arguing over who has the right to claim a throne that was abolished before most of them were born. The family that ruled 1/6 of the Earth's surface now gathers for occasional reunions, issues competing press statements, and watches as Russia commemorates the centenary of their ancestors' murder. In 2018, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children as passion bearers, martyrs who accepted death with Christian humility. 106 years after Yekaterinburg, the Romanovs exist in a strange, suspended state, too prominent to be forgotten, too divided to speak with one voice, too distant from power to matter politically, and yet still here. The blood still flows, the name endures, and the arguments over who gets to use it continue with no resolution in sight. Not all fallen dynasties endured even this much. When the Romanovs fell in 1917, the Habsburgs of Austria-Hungary were watching closely. Within a year, their empire would collapse too, their emperor exiled, their children scattered across 3 continents. But the Habsburg story took a different turn. If you want to know what happened to the bloodline of the longest ruling dynasty in European history, watch our video on the fate of the Habsburg children after the empire fell.